So good evening once again, good morning or good noon, kung saan man wherever you are right now or what time zone you are in right now. We're back with another episode of Two Guys One Pod again with starring Philip, starring talaga, with Philip, with us giving his insights again. So this episode we're gonna be talking about church, but specifically mega churches, because all of us three belong to a mega church, and we have some insights. I mean, growing up in a mega church, and the biggest question that we're gonna tackle with definitely some side questions is the mega church model a good model for doing church? So, I guess to start off with, I'll give the floor to Janice to define really, at least, Janice, what is a mega church?
So we are referring to a non-denominational evangelical megachurch. So by megachurch, there's normally I think a number. Meron siya talagang set number. Usually, I think if you have a regular attendance of I think 1,000 or 2,000, if we got the exact numbers, you're already considered a megachurch. And generally, we're referring to here yun nga, yung non-denominational, you're not belonging to a particular mainline Protestant denomination, which is yung mga Presbyterians, Baptists, or the Methodists, no? So, or the Lutherans. So, non-denominational evangelical megachurch.
So, thanks, Janice, for defining what a mega church is. Now, I guess before we move forward with the podcast really is not a criticism towards mega churches. It's really more of a critical thinking, so to speak, on how churches are based on our experiences, definitely, and the stuff that we read, and definitely from people we also interact with. What were their thoughts that influence our thoughts as well? So, just to give a little background on our church experience, for me, my experience in church is, yeah, I used to be a Catholic, and but my family went to this small church in UP, and it was a really small church, maybe no more than 100. 100 is really a lot already, and it had a very homey feel. I remember we were doing what do you call this, communion with literal bread, and literal bread and actual wine, and I thought that was very communal and very intimate because we shared the same bread. Of course, definitely you cannot do that right now because COVID, and people need to wash hands, and I hope they discontinued the bread now because we don't belong to that church. We transitioned to a bigger church in Ortigas. Yun. So about you, Janice and Philip, what is your church experience or church background?
So, like Dave, I grew up in a Catholic school, and I did generally no, I did consider myself I identified myself as a Catholic growing up, especially during my elementary years. But at the same time, my family was attending a big Pentecostal church in Cubao. So I attended with them, but I didn't really, got engaged with doing church at that time. It was not until I was invited by my sister into a youth service to an evangelical megachurch where I got saved. I became a Christian. I gave my life to Christ. And ever since that time, I have been part of that evangelical megachurch where I was invited by my sister. So I've been part of that church for more than 10 years now. And I'm serving as a small group leader in that church currently.
All right, thank you, Janice, for sharing that. How about you, Philip? What is your church background?
My church background started when I was around 6 or 7, and I started in a Pentecostal church. And then when we left that church because of certain leadership issues that my parents did not agree with, I was still young at that time to understand. We again moved to a Pentecostal church, but like in Dave's experience, it was a very small church. It wasn't even 100 people. It was very homey. It was very communal, to say the least. From there, we gathered with the splinter groups of the church, the people who left the first church I mentioned, and then they formed And then from there, when I sensed that I no longer was growing, like Janice, I was convicted and led by the Holy Spirit to move to this evangelical megachurch. And it is from there that I have truly grown, not just as a disciple of my Bible study leader, but also as a leader leading his own men to become Bible study leaders as well.
All right. Thank you, Philip, for sharing that. So now, before we go into the actual question, the main question, is mega church a good model for doing church? I'd like to ask you guys, Janice or Philip, what do you think are the strengths? Let's start first with strengths of having a or belonging to a mega church, and you can already answer after. What would be certain weaknesses that you might see?
One of the things that I feel that is really a strength of having a mega church is the reach. So with the membership, and normally like a lot of these mega churches are structured in such a way that they're operated like a business. And I'm not saying that as necessarily as a bad thing, but they're operated like a business, an actual organization, and that actually helps these churches reach out more to people. So given the sheer number of not just members but volunteers and leaders within these churches, it's very easy to mobilize people, and it's very easy to actually reach out consequently to people of influence, given that you have such a big base of congregants. And these congregants normally would also come from, very not naman influential, but they're also in what we would call in Christianese the marketplace. So like ministering in their own workplaces. So I think, yeah, the number one is like big strength of a mega churches generally are the reach that they have. So that's really like a big push for the Great Commission. And another is, aside from the reach, a lot of the members in these churches are also given a lot of, I think, I don't know what the right term is, but there's a lot of support. It's not necessarily in the form of teaching, but there are a lot of resources that they can access. I'm speaking from my own experience where if you need, let's say, uh, like a ready-made Bible study for a particular topic, you can just go to your library or the training ministry within your church, and they will probably have it for you. So there really is that kind of convenience that the church really is run like an organization. And again, I'm not saying that as a negative or a positive thing. It's just really that how it is, but it does bring good effect. Challenges of mega churches, it's both the strength and the weakness that it's so large. I think you go halimbawa, no, you go to your Sunday services, and you just go. I mean, like my experience is you don't really get to interact with a lot of people, except your family, and then maybe you say hi to some friends that you've seen in the service, and then you just go home.
Yeah, it's
And
not
I,
like a bar where you go after service, like, hey, you come here often, kind of thing.
yeah. Like it's one big gathering, and ironically, in spite of how many people there are, there's not the a huge opportunity. There's very little opportunity to really interact with people. It's different though if you're in the youth ministry where I basically grew up in the faith in. That is very different. But I'm talking about like the general Sunday worship experience. So, pag youth ministry, ano iba eh. Talagang kakalala mo halos lahat eh. Yeah, that feels like very personal. But when it comes to like Sunday services, that's one thing na. And consequently, ganun na rin. Like parang, I don't want to jump the gun kasi pag-uusapan natin mamaya ito eh. But in general, parang ako personally, I would want to interact more with our pastoral leaders, but they're so far away. They're so far away. So it really is like it that I think is a drawback. That if you want, of course, you have a small group, but if you want more like actual interaction with your church leadership, then that's not really there. So, and then initially, those are the things that I have in mind, Dave.
Right. Great insights. Like positives definitely reach, but negatives is actually internal reach. So you have like the positive side is you have like external reach and resources available to you. But when it comes to internal reach, when you're actually being intimate with or just want to be intimate with other members, it's very difficult. Similarly, it's difficult to be intimate with the leadership as well, to be able to share your thoughts or just to share how you are, or to make yourself some level of give yourself some level of visibility within the community. It's difficult. I mean, if you've been to whoever's listening, if you've been to a Sunday church, I mean, if you're with someone who has, or if you're someone who has a lot of friends, good. But if sometimes it feels lonely in a sea of a crowd,
Yeah.
after a service. So, in any case, thank you, Janice, for insights. How about you, Philip?
Janice already mentioned one part, but I will say it's the resources. A megachurch usually has the capability to produce their own material that they can cascade to the members so that they can continue equipping the members who will then equip new members who will then be able to bring in more people. And therein for me lies the problem that in the sense sometimes the equipping or the discipleship becomes very cookie cutter, where it is about the goal, it is about what has to be done, which is true, but the focus on the individual's capability is not assessed properly. They just encourage to reach out that they can do it. But if I were to tagalize it, it's almost like sapilitan. Na, kaya mo yan, without really assessing, wait, kaya ba talaga ng tao mo yan? Or ng disciple mo yan, or the person in your care? Because as James, the half brother of Jesus, said, not every one of you should desire to be preachers and teachers, or basically anyone in leadership. So for me, with regard to resources and leadership, sometimes it can just be about, that's the term I was looking for. It sometimes can be about the numbers without focusing on the quality, actual quality of the individual in question. And my mindset isn't to put both of them in a competition where, uy, paunahan kayo mag-lead or dapat sabay kayo mag-lead. No, it's moments like this where I assess whether a person is capable or not this time. And if not this time, then some other time. But I will continue growing you. I will continue encouraging you to do so. It's not something that I will just push for because we said, first dapat March. No. But sometimes that can be the concern in the megachurch because there's the available equipment, there's the available resources. It seems like you have no other choice but to do so without even evaluating if the person truly is ready and truly understands the risks of being in ministry as a servant, as a member, or even more seriously, being in ministry as a leader, because that's a whole other ball game altogether.
Right. So yeah, I understand your point. So a while ago, Johnny said that one of the strengths of the mega church is easy mobilization, but to the point of Philip, sometimes that mobilization comes at the cost of somebody else's time, and there is that temptation, to think about church members or church volunteers as people you can just mobilize without even having to ask them to, can you pray about serving here, can you pray about serving there, is it do you believe that it is your calling? There's not even that question, which should have been the point in the first place of serving, but para siyang held at gunpoint. Are you able to do this or not? I can cite an example when that happened. I mean, a lot of times that happened to me as well. Where somebody's pushing me, oh, you become a leader like this, I like that. When I was younger, when I was in the youth, I really felt pressured. to become a leader, to lead, and when I, fall from grace kung kuno, or fall from that expectation, it really bugged me. It really, put me down, and took a while before I could recover from that. And then, the trauma of leadership suddenly comes, and you're gonna think, am I gonna am I gonna feel bad again or fall again, etc. Now that I'm older, though, when that happens, it's easy for me to shove it off because I'm older. I can assess things more, and I can think about things more. I remember recently, one of our elders was asking me, "Oh, Dave, ano ka na? Lead ka na, ha? I already signed you up in the leadership training." And I'm like, I just signified that I'm willing, but alam mo yun, but I haven't gotten a alam mo yun, a thumbs up from the Lord just yet, and it doesn't feel like, or based on my quiet time or circumstance, none of what God is telling me is say go forth and lead this ministry, etc. So I really had to step on the brakes there and really had to be firm. And if that was younger me, I would have felt pressured and I would have gone into ministry without prayer. But now that I'm older, understanding all of these things, of course I could say no, etc., etc. And I think it's not just because of age. Some people who are new in the faith um might also feel that level of pressure, you know what I'm so those are the things that I think Philip brings to a good point, that while big churches have the numbers, sometimes it becomes just numbers, and we think that there is strength in numbers, but really, at least on my end, strength should be in the Lord, right? So in any case, with all these insights, is there a right way then of doing church, right? So we've heard the stories, the mega church stories. We've also seen the newer paradigm shifts of having church as always just small groups, and church equals to small groups, and that should be enough, right? What are your thoughts on these? Is there a proper way of doing church? Janice, Philip?
Like I'll start off with like some background before I get to like I still attend, yeah, a non-denominational evangelical megachurch, but I think a few years ago I I got really influenced by what was called the Young Restless Reform movement in the United States. So if you're familiar with that term, that refers to the rise of basically the resurgence of Calvinism and deep study of theology in the church, in the Protestant evangelical world. So I in the last few years ago, I became Calvinist basically in terms of my soteriology, or how I view God saves people. And through that experience, I got oriented with much more deeper studies of theology, and eventually I got acquainted with some people who are actually coming from a different type of church that I'm used to. So the I there was a point in my spiritual journey where I was searching for a deeper study of theology, so to speak. And I admittedly, there came a point in my time in my current church where I felt like I wasn't being fed anymore spiritually. So it led me to this church also near my neighborhood that was a reformed church. I met some people online in like a Christian anime forum out of all the places, and this church, it's called the Reformed Church. The denomination is Reformed, and nung una, akala ko yung Reformed lang, given my experience with the Young Restless Reformed movement, meant that you subscribe to the Calvinism, or more specifically, Calvinist soteriology, which is the view of Calvinists on how God saves people. But when I went and attended one of the services in this church, I found out that Reformed theology and being Reformed, that term, is much more than that. There is a certain way that they do church, very liturgical, actually very reminiscent of how you do things in the Catholic Church, minus all of the idols and the everything else that we're not comfortable with as Protestants.
But it maintains the solemnity of a Catholic service, correct?
I'll get to that. Like, so
Okay.
it very liturgical. Yeah. So I accurate to say it must maintains the solemnity of a Catholic service. So what happens in a Reformed service, a Presbyterian service, is they have a reading of the Word, and they actually have a corporate confession of sins, a corporate recitation of the Nicene Creed, which is Apostles' Creed, and all of the preaching is normally expository, meaning it's normally not topical. It's normally focused on ex- um, trying to mine the biblical text. And the biggest difference, I think, with the Reformed church that I attended compared to like a non-denominational evangelical megachurch is that they sung hymns, exclusively hymns. They actually don't like contemporary Christian music, and there's a certain theological reason why they don't like it. But I think one of the reasons is that it feels they want they it feel like a lot of the contemporary Christian music is repetition of certain phrases, and then it's not theological deep, and but yeah, so a very different experience. But I felt like leaving that service really edified so much that I attended their theological conference, and from that point, I learned more about why church was being done that way. So they have what they call in Reformed theology, one, the regulative principle of worship. I'm not an expert on it, but they believe that there is a certain affirmation from Scripture about the way you should do church. And consequently, in Reformed theology, there is what you call the ordinary means of grace. The ordinary means of grace are the things that God uses in the regular Christian's life that he uses to edify you and sustain you in the faith. So that's the reading of the word, I think the fellowship with other believers, and corporate worship. What really changed my, hindi pala changed my mind, what really like transformed the way I thought about it was hearing them. It was a theologian who was talking about it, who was an expert on these things during that conference. His name was Dr. Chad Van Dixhorn. And he talked about why it's important for us to be able to attend church, why to actually attend corporate worship and actually belong to a local church. And he said that the pastor should it's important for you to attend corporate worship because the feeding of the word that you get from your pastor is supposed to be fine-tuned to the needs of the congregation. So, and that really like changed my mindset about like whole things, because at the time I felt like I wasn't being spiritually fed when I attended Sunday service and whatnot. And then I realized because it correlated with how huge the congregation that I belonged to was, because of how big the church itself was and how diverse the people there. Our pastor wouldn't be able to do what Dr. Van Dixhorn was talking about in this much smaller local church. The idea of preaching and going to corporate worship, your pastor is not just a preacher that you listen to, but it's really like a pastor in every sense of the word, that pastor is preaching to you because he wants to be able to preach the word according to your needs. Not that he's suiting the word for you, but the way he has you in mind
He
when
knows what
you're
you
able to
need spiritually.
what your needs are as a congregation spiritually, and then you get to interact with the pastor outside of the actual services. So that really like, oh my gosh, like that changed my view of things. And now I'm at the point where I'm not yet there where I say that I subscribe to the regulative principle of worship, where there's an affirmation of like scripture about things. And I think like even the reformed guys would say that. But I am leaning towards being attracted to that model. I I I guess like me coming to faith in an evangelical church, I rejected any idea of being liturgical when I left the Catholic Church because I felt that it was like very empty. But now, and looking at like my experience in my surgery and hearing Dr. Van Dyck's sword and going to that church, I'm inclined to say that maybe this is the way to do church. I don't know. Like I'm at that place. So I'm at that place.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Johnny. It's like this the regulatory principle,
Regulative principle
the
of worship.
regulative principle of worship.
That's what they
And
called it. Yeah.
yeah, I do affirm that. At least the way I agree is church services should be very much expository. I think that's something that's lost in many modern churches, like a real study of the word rather than, hey, this week we're going to talk about puberty or something. Not that topical is wrong, but I think it has a place. Maybe not in Sunday service, maybe an event. And I'm very thankful that our conservative Baptist church, where I belong to, does a lot of expository. It's its main way of preaching. Any case, how about you, Philip?
Oh wow, I'm really excited to answer that because that is a loaded question with a lot to unpack. First, we must unpack what does it mean to do church. And if we look at the model of Jesus, one thing that Jesus did that was very that started what would become the ideal church was that he wasn't stuck in one town. He spoke to people, he ministered to them, he elaborated on the word, and sometimes he got into hot water with the authorities. And if you look at the early church, what the disciples, what the apostles did was very, very similar. They went out, they shared the word, and they reconvened in a building maybe a few times a year just to realign, to reconnect, and then go out again.
Annual General Assembly, something like that.
Exactly. What are we doing? Where are we going? What's next with you? Okay, you're going there. All right. You go there. Okay, we'll see you in a year. Sadly, what we're seeing is the exact opposite. We're going out less and less, sharing the gospel, preaching the word, ministering to people. And what we're doing more is convening in a general assembly every week. We have been really very comfortable. We sit in a very comfy chair in an environment that's air conditioned with an audio visual presentation and someone actually preaching the word to us, which is great. Are we fulfilling the Great Commission? Are we serious about going about that? I'm looking also at the early church because when you see the first time they formed in Acts 2 towards the last end of the chapter, what were they doing? They were together everywhere. These men and women hung out every day. And I was joking around with my disciples about this before. Can you imagine they lived with each other? They saw each other every day. I just see you once a week and I'm like, see you next week. Can you imagine if that happened to us? We'd be sick of each other. It's you again. Oh God, I saw you on Monday. I'm seeing you on Tuesday. I'm seeing you on Friday next week. But that's what happened. And guess what? Because they were that intentional in bringing the fellowship, the church, the koinonia, wherever they were, not just stuck to one building or place or area, the church grew because they were out there. They were going where they had to be. And I think we have lost that. We are so comfortable sitting in church. We are so comfortable just taking everything in. Where is the actual living out of being the church? Then it hit me hard because I used to be like that. I used to be so comfortable with like with getting disciples, with having a discipleship team serve me by bringing me the disciples. Fishermen don't wait in a boat for the fish to fall in. They cast the net, they do the work. And that's something that I was very much challenged with. It's that, where is that? Where is that church? Where is you, the group, or your group being the fellowship, and showing that to people? And which leads to my second point. If we're not to congregate in the church often because we are the church, we are the body of Christ, where are our good deeds of being where people who need us? Where is that initiative to go out there into the world to show them we're different? If you're not even able to hold yourself from condemning someone who's smoking or drinking in front of you, when in the Bible Jesus hung out with the dregs of society. He hung out with prostitutes. He hung out with tax collectors who were basically corrupt politicians or corrupt people in power, you know, and he ministered to them. I mean, where is that? And I say that because I too have to deal with that holier than thou purity mentality. And that just reminds me a lot about the time when early Christians were persecuted by the Romans, that they had to retreat to caves. And ironically enough, that's where the Roman people buried their dead. But because the Christians had that spot, the Christians were getting the choicest burial sites. And the Romans were like, we can't bury people anywhere. And these Christians in the caves, when they heard about that problem of the Romans, they actually said, you know what, here, we'll give you our burial plot. Bury your dead here. And it was because of that ministering, that grace, that overlooking of the cultural and political differences, that Romans actually converted to Christianity, because they said, these guys, we killed them, we drove them out, and they're offering us a burial place for our dead. How can you not be transformed by something like that? So where is that kind of church? If there's a right way of doing church, it's this. I'm talking about being a good Samaritan, to an unbeliever, not because you want to minister to that person, but because doing good in spite of is part of being a follower of Christ. And Jesus Christ did that. He died on the cross in spite of people still not believing in him. My third point would be, as a church, what the early Christians did was they studied scripture, but they didn't get it from one central source. I mean, yes, there was Jesus Christ and there was the disciples, but they didn't gather once a week to just sit, listen, and read, and then make a week pass and then do the same thing again. No. Every Christian, every follower of Christ would study the word every day. And of course, back then, because they understood the language of Aramaic, and which was and Koine Greek, and also ancient Hebrew, it was easier for them to understand the background and the context and the history. But for us today, I'll be honest, that's a lost art. We sometimes just read the Bible as is and interpret it in many different ways apart from the context. So that's part of being the church as well. Shedding light on what is confusing, because the Bible has been translated and actually mistranslated from from ancient Hebrew to Aramaic to Koine Greek to English. And so if people want to ask me, is there a right way of doing church? Yeah, it's in the Bible, but the part of it also is And this is something that I'm part of, and I'm also guilty of, and I hope we all realize it. We've strayed so far from what the church was. Really, if you want to check it against the Bible, didn't say sit in a church every sit in a building every week, get the word. No, it's life on life to do.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. I see. It's nice that we're having this conversation because, like, I see like two, not necessarily contrasting, but two very different ideas. So, like, one is a very structured way of doing church, which is also biblical, as Janice mentioned, and Philip mentioning a less structured but more action oriented way of doing church. Like, you go out and you do things more than just meeting once a week in a structure or in a building. It's really more of building communities, and I do appreciate these kinds of perspectives because I think these are kind of like piece parts of a puzzle, like pieces of the puzzle. And maybe it's not one way, or maybe it's actually combining those, and that's the direction we might need to go you know and I think that's leading on to the last set of questions, which would summarize what we've been talking about, like how can we exactly help our congregations do these things that we are mentioning. I'm happy to note that with the church that I do belong to in Ortigas is leaning towards that. It's been a long journey because um I've been exposed to community churches in 2012 when I attended my first Kairos course, and I I did realize na oo nga no, you know there are different ways of doing church. It's not just a Sunday service. It's not just listening to people. It's really a gathering of believers, sharing the word and going out and multiplying, and all that stuff that Jesus said. And it's more than just a Bible study. Church actually helps communities. Wherever you are, you help people where you are. Definitely there should be structure in the way you do things, but at the same time you go forth and you help out people. You become Christ like, in the point of Philip, to others that need Christ, because we are ambassadors, and we are I know. And I think it's been a long journey for my church, but it's getting there because since then we've started devolving. Before, we used to have like a central church in Ortigas, and our branches are like the mini branch of our church. But um like a decade ago we devolved and said, no, no, this isn't gonna work out. Each branch should be their own individual church, and that is the local church. It may carry the same name, but the leadership is up to the local pastors, the local congregation. And it didn't stop from there. I think it was in 2017 or 2018 that we implemented the Oikos program. And this is a word Philip mentioned a while ago, Oikos. um the Oikos program is really church through small groups, that you don't necessarily need to bring the small group members into the bigger congregation every Sunday, but just having at least a small group wherever you are, planting a church. Kumbaga, the definition of church planting has been freed up a bit more into small groups. And the way we defined church was actually small group, where it's literally a group of people, a community, whether your friends or family and even your neighbors. You meet once a week. Sounds a lot like Sunday service, but it doesn't have to be Sunday. And you get edified by the word. And I think that's the kind of structure that we need, which I appreciate about our church leaning into, that there is less emphasis on Sunday church and more emphasis on small groups. and it's been devolving. Small groups isn't just in the building, that church. You don't have to, but the church offers its resources if you want your small group to be held there. But I do appreciate as well that they also extend the resources to us, as small group leaders. If we need to, at least order food, they extend resources to us. Definitely, they also extend the materials, and this is to the point of Janice a while ago. The good thing about mega churches, it's we have resources, we have the modules, we have, from time immemorial, we could dig up any kind of small group module and just repurpose that. And I think, um the, all this to say, I think that's a model that maybe churches can implement. I don't believe that we have the perfect science, but I like the direction that my church is going, because it's devolution. Anyone who does study the word, you don't necessarily need to be a pastor to shepherd. If you're a small group leader, you shepherd the people around you, and definitely you get your feeding from a bigger shepherd, which is, at least in our model, that's the pastor. But the church really encourages every single one, every member of the congregation, to get out there, start your own small group, aka your small church. So that, enough about my sentiment. How about you guys? Is there a way we can help our congregation move forward?
uh, yeah, I like what Dave said. No, I like what you said about like how the developments in your church. And I think like in the case of our congregation, I think the first thing that you should be doing if you're like a member who has certain sentiments about the way we do things, I think the first thing is you always try to keep in mind that the posturing of a Christian, I think, in this situation is again, and we emphasize this at the beginning of the podcast of this episode, is that we're whatever we say shouldn't be like empty criticism. It has to be coming from the heart of somebody who wants to be able to serve and edify the church. We give inputs because we want to be able to build the church up, and we believe that the church can still do better if we have. And then the second step, I think, is to be able to engage the church leadership. Really, like in our case, it I communicate a lot of these things to my immediate small group leader, who is himself leader, is actually a full-time worker within the church. So since I don't have a direct connection with our pastor, so that's what I do. And if you do have an opportunity to talk to your pastors, then by all means do so, because if we just keep this to ourselves, it will be nothing but empty criticism and even bordering on gossip, I think. So we need to be able to get into that area where we have to be able to voice out in love these things to our congregation. If it comes to a point, I think, that things don't change and it's affecting you spiritually, I think you can prayerfully consider moving to another congregation. And as much as possible, leave gracefully without really burning bridges or anything.
Thank you for that, Janice. Yeah, that's right. Parang I guess in a way that we want to empower the listener to, if you have sentiments, talk to your pastor, talk to your church. Maybe there is a proper way of doing things, and if that really doesn't sit well with you, do consider moving somewhere else, because not because, oh my gosh, they didn't listen to me, but it's really more of, I'm really not being fed. So yeah, thank you for that, Janice. How about you, Philip?
I was actually going to affirm what Jan A said because that's exactly what I did in my previous church before I moved to the church I'm in now. Well, the reason why I also left that previous church was because of a leadership issue. There was a leadership issue, and I confronted it And sadly, it was not dealt with properly. And so I realized, okay, if the leadership is not okay, I can't stay here because that's not right. Number one, but second of all, I really wasn't growing anymore. In fact, if that leadership concern did not happen, I still would have said goodbye because I was not growing in my spiritual life. And I said my goodbyes. I left. And by October of 2010, I was officially a member of the church I've been now. And really, I've never looked back. Sure, I've had some challenges, but I really can say even up until now, I am growing, and I am so thankful that I made that decision, even if there were people that were a bit against it. So, how can we help our congregation with this concern? I really my only advice on the topic is to really teach what's in the Bible, to show what's in the Word of God, because the format's there. Everything's laid out there. We just have to check it. When you see how the early church acted and who the early church actually were, that's the example we need to follow because that's what Jesus established.
Oh, thank you, Janice. Thank you, Philip, for your responses. Ano. And again, this is all to more of edify and empower whoever the listener is. Maybe you're in that point of your life, you're not growing, or maybe you feel pressured by the church, or maybe you're a seeker. You're seeking somewhere, and you happen to stumble upon this podcast, and you know you're able to listen in. I hope this is something that makes you think. I hope that it's something that informs your decisions. Definitely, all our decisions should be informed by the Bible, and everything we are saying, Janice, Philip, and I, is really just how we understand Scripture as well. And I hope you do your own reading rather than just listening to these three guys doing podcast therapy. Um, but thank you for listening
Exactly.
in. So with that, thank you everyone for listening in. I hope you were edified, if not scandalized, by this podcast. And like, share, and subscribe. Hope to see you again in the next episode. So bye bye.